Good evening. I'm Elizabeth Alexander, president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And I'd like to begin by inviting all of you who are watching to say hello in the chat. I see your names streaming in, and it is a wonderful thing. We may not be able to see, but it's so good to know where you're from, and hope that you will also have questions later on in the program. And you can put them in the chat at any point, your questions. Today, we welcome you to a discussion about the legacies of Emmett Till and his mother, Mamie Till-Mobley, and the importance of preserving their stories for future generations of Americans. As many of you know, but it's a story that needs to be told again, it was the summer of 1955 that Emmett Till, an energetic, funny, outgoing 14-year-old boy, left his home in Chicago to go see his family, his extended family in the Mississippi Delta. During his visits, he and his cousin made a fateful stop to buy bubblegum at Bryant's Grocery and Meat Market in the small town of Money, Mississippi. After Till left the store, the white woman who owned it with her husband alleged that Till had flirted with her. 4 nights later, the boy was kidnapped, brutally tortured, and murdered by a group of white men. Most historians think at least 7 were involved. It's a story that continues to this day to unfold. And when Till's body was later pulled from the Tallahatchie River, it was, of course, disfigured beyond recognition. It was his mother, Mamie Till-Mobley, who insisted that her son's body be returned to her in Chicago. Let the world see what they did to my boy. This is an unimaginable nightmare that tortures Black mothers in particular. Elizabeth Catlett's work, The Torture of Mothers, which we will see here, speaks poignantly to this relentless fear. When Till-Mobley saw her son's body and called it back to Chicago, she made another crucial decision, and that was that people should have a chance to mourn her son. More than 100,000 people came to the south side of Chicago. Countless more throughout the United States learned his story when photographs of the open casket and funeral were published in Jet magazine. Emmett Till's story and his mother's bravery energized further action in the civil rights movement. Just as today, in our current moment, the stories of Ahmaud Arbery, Brianna Taylor, and too many others who have been murdered because of race-based hatred have galvanized people to fight for racial justice. By choosing to make her son's story visible, Mamie Till-Mobley became a history maker and a history keeper. So too, the loved ones of so many people who are murdered today. Gwendolyn Brooks, in her great poem that I know is familiar to our guests, the last quatrain of the Ballad of Emmett Till, which follows the astonishing a Brownsville mother loiters, meanwhile a Mississippi mother burns bacon, gives us a sense of the cost of this personal choice to turn unbearable private grief into a public act. And here's the short poem. Imagine Mamie Till-Mobley. Emmett's mother is a pretty-faced thing, the tint of pulled taffy. She sits in a red room, drinking black coffee. She kisses her killed boy, and she is sorry. Chaos in windy grays through a red prairie. And I've always been astonished in that poem in the way that the word chaos blooms the poem open, lets loose the grief, and that the red prairie, and if you think back to that Catlett picture and the infinite spreading blood, is something that takes everything. For many of us, the story of Emmett Till and his mother are bred in the bone, but the generations that knew Till-Mobley and that have experienced their story contemporaneously are among our elders. Emmett Till, were he alive, would have turned 80 years old this past Sunday. The imperative to keep telling their stories and make clear their centrality to the ongoing fight for justice in the United States has become ever more urgent, and that is what we are going to turn to today. Recent legislation efforts around the country have attempted and in some instances succeeded in making the history of stories like Emmett Till's more difficult to teach. In Texas, for example, the Texas Senate has just passed a bill that would modify which historical documents must be taught in public schools. Among them, and these were documents that could not be taught, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, Native American history, and the writings of women's suffrage movement leader Susan B. Anthony. Public schools in the state in this bill would no longer be required to teach, quote, the history of white supremacy, such as slavery or the Ku Klux Klan, including the ways in which that group was morally wrong. And so, in thinking about how to ensure that stories like those of Emmett Till and his mother are never forgotten, this is becoming more and more critical. So, joining us today in this vital work are two of our most important thinkers, scholars, writers, and to me, friends. Crystal Feimster is Associate Professor of African American Studies, History, American Studies, and Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Yale University. Her scholarship includes the book Southern Horrors, Women and the Politics of Rape and Lynching, and her forthcoming Truth Be Told, The Battle for Freedom in Civil War-Era Louisiana. And Kevin Young is the director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture and the poetry editor of The New Yorker. His award-winning work includes more than 13 books of poetry and prose. So much more I could say about both of them, but I will simply welcome them. Crystal and Kevin, we are so glad to have you with us today.
Thank you for having us, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Thank you. So I will ask each of you, starting with Crystal, do you remember when you first heard the story of Emmett Till and how it affected you?
You know, I can't honestly say I remember the first time, but I remember the first time I was impacted by the story of Emmett Till. And I was an undergraduate. Like so many undergraduates in the 90s, a product of the civil rights movement and affirmative action, sitting in a class with an African American professor, taking an African American history class, viewing Eyes on the Prize. And that was the moment, sitting in a dark room. That first episode of Eyes on the Prize opens with Emmett Till and his death. And really sort of maps his life and Mamie Till-Mobley's choices after his death as an instigator for what we think about as the modern civil rights movement. So for me, it was as a student that I really sort of imbibed and understood the meaning of Emmett Till's death and the significance of it. And so that was in a classroom. But I know that I knew about it before, but it was only when I saw the images. I didn't see the Jet magazine until I saw it on the Eyes on the Prize documentary. And it's interesting to think that I learned about it as a student, and as a teacher now, I'm often presenting and my students are learning about it for the first time in the classroom. And I think that's why it's so important that we're having these conversations and linking this history to this current political moment, right? Because the classroom is where so many students of my generation, many of the historians of my generation, we learn this stuff on college campuses in classrooms. And so I think it's really important for us to think about the role of education and the classroom, and particularly in this moment where the Republican Party is really trying to beat that back.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. Kevin, what about you?
I have a similar story, which is I don't recall exactly when, but I do know that I actually was taking a class at Harvard with Julian Bond, who was teaching a class and the great civil rights leader about civil rights. And it was right when Eyes on the Prize was coming out. And so he's the narrator of Eyes on the Prize. So here was like living history for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that image, that whole series, I mean, you sat there experiencing almost kind of double history, the moment that you were in, and that kind of quality, which I think we often experience with last summer, say George Floyd, we're experiencing other traumas, familiar connections, but viewing that in, must have been 1990, 1991, something like that. 30 years ago, and hearing his voice tell us the story of the movement, both in class and then in screenings, it was just incredibly powerful. And I think that what it did for me is humanize the movement, and I think that's what Till's death did for people, is it personalized a moment. He wasn't the first, sadly, and he hasn't been the last, but he's very much someone who connects us to that experience. And I was with my son, who was exactly his age, when I went to the museum that I now run. It was before I ran it, to see his casket, which we have the honor of holding in the museum. And you can't help but think about what that meant for Mamie Till-Mobley, what it meant for those who walked in Chicago to see him, what it means for us today. And I too hadn't seen that Jet magazine till then, and we have representations of it very powerfully, I think, in that sacred space in our museum. And to see that, I think, is just to connect to this tragic history, but also to galvanize one and make you think about what you need to do next.
And I want to ask you more in a minute about that sacred display at the museum. But continuing, I would love to hear from both of you about how this is a story about the Great Migration. Both of you have thought a lot about Southern roots, have thought a lot about people's roots. And could you talk about this as a story of Mississippi folks who made their way to Chicago and what it meant to send your child back, and how you prepare a child for those movements? It's complicated.
It is, and it's still so potent, right? This summer I went back with my kids for 2 weeks to North Carolina. 2 summers before that, I sent them back without me to be with their grandparents, and I can't not help but think about all the Black kids who went back, who've gone back for generations and generations, right? And it is a story of migration, and it's not one way, right? That we know for Mamie Mobley, that migration, she moved when she was quite young to Chicago. Her family was part of that first Great Migration, and she went back in the summers. Right. And so for her to send Emmett back was part of that family. And she had anxiety about that. There's no question about that. We all do, right? That there is a culture shift and cultural shock, however we want to think about that. But there's also a familiarity, right? That was clearly part of Emmett's experience of going back, right? That the South was family. And I think that that's the thing that I know with my own kids when I send them back. They may not understand everything about the South, but to them, the South is really about Black family and everything that comes with that, the joys and the novelties, right? And that was one of the things that I think Mamie wanted for Emmett, and that Emmett experienced. Right? They talk. If you read Mamie's memoir and her writing about his experience, right? It is about these deep connections and these long histories, right? And even Mamie had to return to her experience of Mississippi and own that, right? When she ultimately said that she had moved to Chicago, and what happened in the South happened in the South, had nothing to do with her. And she had to come reckon with that, right? That what happened in the South actually mattered, that it wasn't about Black people escaping to the promised land, right? And then I think what we're going to see as we talk about this story and how it unfolds is that it's a national story, right? We can identify the kind of nuance and the kind of I hate to say backwardness of Mississippi and what Mississippi symbolizes, but it symbolizes the nation. And that was something that I think often gets cut from that narrative when we're focused on migration. We move to the North where it's all good. But for Black people, it's never a clean break. And it's never been a clean
That's
break,
right.
right?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
my parents were the first generation to leave Louisiana, which was a little later, almost a generation after the Tills did. And I think that what's interesting is we always called it home. My parents would say, "We're going to go home," and so growing up and moving around a lot, including to Chicago, that was home for me, and still is. That's this direction, I think. But there is also that notion that I'm glad you touched on, Crystal, of up south. That my father used to
Hmm.
say. It wasn't so much that it was down south and up north; it was the up south, that there was this connection. And
Mhm.
Jim Crow and Jane Crow and all those kinds of questions still haunted one wherever one went. And so that is important to remember. And for me, too, I don't want to lose what you mentioned about the kind of joy, however brief it was, of the freedom of the open spaces and the beauty. And, growing up going to a landscape like, in my case, Louisiana, it's imprinted on me. It's where I think, it's how we ate. It was very much a daily thing, but also then a special thing. And my son happens to be with my mom right now, cooking up a storm,
Uh,
and that's the food he cooks and what he carries with us. So those cultural aspects of Black Southern life, which are foundational, not just to Black folks, but to the nation, I think are really important to make
mhm.
sure we foreground, even as we talk about the price that Emmett Till paid.
Mhm,
And it's
mhm.
really
Um,
about Black folks not willing to cede the South to white supremacists, right? That, in
okay.
the way
Yep.
that we think about escape, right? Or the push and the pull, right? But in many ways, Black folks, we have said we are Southern. The South is ours too, right? It
Right.
may be all of these other things, but we have not been willing to cede the South to the white supremacists,
Mhm.
right? And we see that even as Black folks return south, right? When we think about Georgia and what have you, and these chocolate cities. But I think one could easily imagine a post Emmett Till moment where Black people would cut their losses, right? That like the takeaway from that story could have been, I'm not sending my kids south. That didn't happen. We still send our kids out, right?
Right.
Even to this day. And I think that that is part of that resilience and that joy and that beauty and really claiming a Black South that people would have us not claim, right?
That is so powerful. That is so powerful. And I think that the underbelly of that when you move from Emmett Till to a lot of the modern day stories we're dealing with, is that we see very clearly that the North is not the promised land, that the North is a place where violence can find you unexpectedly because of the color of your skin. Because the whole range of stories that we mourn in these years are stories that take place everywhere we are. So I think that that's a kind of potent shift. Kevin, I would love to hear more about the casket and its display in the museum, and what you can tell us about the decision that Secretary Bunch made, your predecessor, to make that the only thing that you cannot photograph in the museum. Making understanding its sanctity, but above all other aspects of Black life that are displayed there. Can you tell us something about that, and also about how you see visitors responding to it?
Yeah, very much. I think that was such a good decision, and I think that was made in conjunction with the family as well. But what it means is that the sacred moment is still preserved in this way that I think you have to be present in that space. I've had we've recently reopened, and so I've brought people through that space, some very prominent people, and it's to a person you get stunned into, if not silence, then reflection. If not reflection, then weeping. If not weeping, then grabbing the person next to you, even though social distancing is in effect. There is a really powerful
Mm.
connection that people make. It's, I think, a form of witnessing, and it's a very much what the folks who lined up to see the casket originally experience, one imagines, you do have to line up generally because of the crowd that gathers there. And I know all along the way I was sort of preparing myself, and like I said, I was with my son, who was his age, who knew who he was. And I think one of the chilling things, I guess, about the current moment, which you also mentioned, is that there was last summer an image, I think Kadir Nelson did it, that was on the New Yorker, and it had George Floyd and these other victims of police and
Yes.
extrajudicial violence. And my son and I went through, and we could identify most of them just by
Mm,
face.
mm.
This is a roll call one never wants to have happen. And especially my 13-year-old son being able to say, oh, yeah, that's Emmett Till, that's Tamir Rice, that's this, that is the long legacy of Till's loss. And I think it's both haunting and good that we know their faces in life, and that's part of, I think, the power that Mamie Till-Mobley provided. It isn't just showing his, just disfigured face, his lynched body, but also showing this is the before and after. This is what he used to look like. This is the smiling young man, the boy who didn't get to become a man. And I think thinking about him on his 80th birthday, you just can't help but think back to that smiling face and what he might have been like now, the life taken from him and from all of us. And I think that quality is one you observe in the museum. I think it's a place that changes you, even if you know all about it. If you don't know about it, here it is for you to witness. Um, and I think it's just a transformative space. And there's other spaces like that that I think are going to be, especially this fall, powerful, including we're displaying the Brianna Taylor portrait done by Amy Sherrill. And it reminds me of that afterlife, and the life of the image. And what Sherrill said she wanted to capture was the living Brianna Taylor. She used a black designer for her dress. She put a ring on her finger. She really captured her life in essence. And I think that's been really moving to see that transformative power of art. But I also think visiting Till's memorial has a similar transformative quality in visitors.
Mhm, listen to you talk about your son's ability to identify all those faces, all those people. I think we do have to go further in as the parents of our beautiful Black boys, and because we have the privilege, I know your babies and you know mine, both of you, which I hadn't thought about before this call, but that is a wonderful and special thing. And so, Crystal, if you could pick up for us, thinking about the boys, thinking about, and we're gonna talk about the girls too, but our children, and the younger ones. I've thought about it with my 21 and 23-year-old. Can you talk about, as Gwendolyn Brooks would say, what shall I tell my children who are Black?
Right. I mean, I can answer this question as a mother, and I can answer it as a historian, and I'll try to do both. Um, you know, thinking back to Kevin and I's answer to your first question, and I was thinking as you were talking, Kevin, how we were in some ways the Rodney King generation, right? So I'm assuming you were in the classroom as an undergraduate, 90 to 94. And I could be wrong. You could be older than me. I'm messing with you, but no. That we were the Rodney King generation,
Sure.
and we were watching Eyes on the Prize, and Emmett Till was speaking to that particular moment for us. And Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, that there were all of these things that really created our generation of activists and scholars. And I think back, I was 19. My youngest is 10. And he knows about Emmett Till, right? He learned about it in fourth grade, in fifth grade this year, right? And And I think, oh, it's important for him to know this. And he learned this with his white classmates. And so as a mother, I had to think about the questions that he brought home, how he experienced that. And it was really sad and it was heartbreaking for him. And it was heartbreaking for me to bear witness with him that loss and also that connection of thinking, well, this happened to this brown boy. Could this happen to me in this moment where they're coming of age with Tamar Rice, right? And so that they understand that it's not just about black men, right? That young boys can be targeted. And I think one of the things that I value and what Mamie Till-Bradley gave us was that she forced us to bear witness. And she continues to force us to bear witness, right? When you said, some of this had to do with how the family wanted this to happen, right? That she forced the nation to bear witness, to say, look what you've done to my child, right? That nobody could look away, right? It started with the Black press, and we know that the Black press has always worked to get the nation to bear witness. But something happened in that moment in 55, right? That the national press picked up that story. And so when I think about the gender politics and I think about our boys, Elizabeth, I think about us as mothers, right? That we can identify Teal as part of a long history of Black boys and Black men being lynched and brutalized. But we can also identify a long chain of Black mothers, right? We can start with our Black women who've experienced the loss of the Black men in their lives that they love, right? We can go right back to Ida B. Wells, right? And her friends in Memphis, and, in the Scottsboro boys, right? That we know that Ada Wright, went on that public speaking tour because two of her boys were among those Scott Boy boys. We can go to Polly Murray and Annie Waddle, Odell, right? That there's this long, that Mamie is part of a long history of Black mothers lost, right? And a part of a long history of Black mothers speaking out, right? Speaking out to this trauma. That when I think about those images, and you see her falling out in front of that casket, we see her heartbroken, right? And so it's very hard for me to disentangle my emotions and what I feel about my boys learning this and having to come to terms with it, right? Because it's a reckoning for me. It's a reckoning for me as a Black mother that I could lose my Black boys, right? And what would I do? What would I do, right? And I don't know. I mean, I imagine for you, Kevin, it comes with a whole different range of set of emotions, right? And I think it's important to remember just because we have different gendered experiences, it doesn't mean that one trumps the other, right? That
That's
we
right.
can see our Black boys be brutalized and not ignore the fact that our Black girls are brutalized. It's not a zero sum game. We just experience
Absolutely.
that. And our role as historians, right, as mothers, as feminists, is to make sure that those stories are told as well, right? It's not a competition. So I do want to talk about the girls, but I think, talking about Emmett doesn't do a disservice to our girls, right? That it's different. So I don't know. I would be curious to hear, Kevin, how, you talked a bit about your son and those conversations, but
Mhm.
I imagine that there's another level, right, as a father that's different from what I feel as a mother.
Yeah, I mean, I think you put it so eloquently. I think that definitely one of the things I've been thinking about, and your powerful response only brings it home, is the idea of testifying. And the men who murdered Till were released by an all-white jury within hours, decided free, and then they sold their story to a national magazine instantly because they were beyond the law, and I think that's a really chilling thing. And so then on against that is all the other kind of testifying, and I mean that in the sort of Black church tradition. I mean it in the legal tradition. I mean it in the ways that I think. what we're witnessing, and it isn't witnessing to me is something where it's not just you see something, but you have to say something later, and you have to speak up, and that's Mamie Till-Mobley. But also, I think of Darnella Frazier, who did the filming of the George Floyd video, which we know from literal testimony was really she feels horrible about, like that she didn't do enough. And I think the Pulitzer Board awarding her an honorary Pulitzer this year was a powerful gesture of reminding us that this digital witnessing is so important. It is the version of showing the casket in some cases, because it things that people have been saying for years, Black people, have been ignored or not seen as true or somehow biased. And here, in front of everyone, and I think that's what Till's body did too, is it told a story that nothing else could do. And it's a shame it came to that. It's a shame that it took filming of a murder in front of our eyes for us to see what was already there. And, that's what I think is really haunting. And I think that digital witnessing, that's how I think of it, is really the difference. And as a museum, it's hard to know, how do you represent that shift? And I think that shift happens very much with Rodney King. But as you know, that's another case where justice took a while to happen. And the uprising in LA was a reaction to that, of course. And I remember vividly, because I think we are about the same age, hearing about it from someone on the street said, "Oh, this crazy thing's happening," telling me the story. And I'm being like, "Wow, what?" And it just almost seemed unreal. But that's, I think, the aspect of history that we have to remember, is that it's happening all around us. And we're part of it. And we have a chance, I think, more than ever, to change it. And so that's one of the things I think the museum moving forward will help us understand, is the way that history is a living thing. And this living part of history is so important to understand. And understanding the past is a way of understanding now and also changing the future.
I would love to hear more from both of you about archives, about we say the archive, but about archives, about Black newspapers. We've talked about not Black magazines like the New Yorker, but I'm thinking particularly of the role of Black newspapers. And if you could speak from the perspective of being a historian, Crystal, and Kevin, of your many hats, the poet hat. And about the archives that allow you to make the things that you each make.
Sure.
Do you want? I feel like I keep going first, Kevin, but I'm gonna let you go
I'll take it
first.
real quick, if you don't mind. I'll be quick, and you can. I guess for me, the poetry part. I mean, there's so many things that come to mind. The first is, I'm aware that Jet Magazine is one of the reasons we're having this conversation, because they publicize the image, and having the Ebony Jet Archive and Mellon being one of the supporters of that is so important. I think, to remember the role that the Black press and the Black-owned press could do that no one else could do. They could print that without asking permission. So that's really important. And the archive, I think, tells that story, and that archive specifically tells a story of Black life in the 20th century. But I also think just poetry does that across the centuries. And for me, I recently edited an anthology of African American poetry, and I was struck doing it how from the beginning there was elements of protest, there's elements of resistance. The mere act of writing was protest. But also then, as you approach the 20th century, and you read so beautifully that Emmett Till poem, just incredible, that quatrain. And Brooks, I think, inaugurates an entire, let's call it, I don't know if it's another tradition within the tradition, of writing about Emmett Till specifically. And Till is by far the most written about civil rights figure, by my reckoning, and looking at the ways that, everyone from Hughes to, my generation, number of people, younger generation, Eve Ewing has a beautiful poem about Till, really embrace him and return to him and try to understand in a personal way. And I think that's the powerful aspect of poetry, that can tell that history in a personal note. We have music to do that. We have poetry too. The arts, I think, I'm thinking about this a lot just because we're displaying this Breonna Taylor portrait and the way that arts can transform and remind us, but also look ahead. And it forms its own archive in that way, but also is mining the archive, looking back, saying this must be remembered, this must be seen. And we have to understand that past, and it's not even past, as Faulkner might say. So I think that that quality is really important to poetry, but also to the daily lives of Black folks who go about with an archive in them, telling their story. And from the beginning, the museum drew these stories out. People gave us these stories. They entrusted us and the Smithsonian with these stories. And I think that's a sacred trust that poets also are fortunate enough to obey, but especially somewhere like the Smithsonian makes happen every day.
Yeah, I love what you said, Kevin, about, we are archives, and the way that we think about art as producing and reimagining, I think in many ways what the archive can be and what's possible, right? So as a historian, I love newspapers because they have a little bit of everything. I mean, we don't get the sound, right? But we can get the rhythm of a poem, right? So that even as early as like 1956, people are writing, anonymous people who we can't even track now, are writing poems about the murder of Emmett Till. And what it's inspiring and what it requires, right? So that in many ways we see not just photographic images and the way in which Mamie Mobley mobilized the press as a call to action, right? That we can see art as a call to action, poetry as a call to action. More than often when we read the work of artists, it's not just they're not just telling you a story in the way that a reporter oftentimes, because they're supposed to be objective and unbiased, are telling us the story. They're giving us the facts, right? That when we read these poems, we're getting the story, but we're also being compelled to move, to act, to have emotion, right? And I think that Mamie understood that, and that she understood it not only in the hours and the days after she learned that her son was kidnapped, because the NAACP ain't playing. They call her. I mean, she's talking to them before they even find the body. So they understand the press. They understand the media, that the crisis is rolling, and she understands that that is the only way that she's going to get answers, right? And so she
Wow.
understands the media, right? And so as a historian, for me, thinking about the archive, right, the newspapers, as we know, can be rich, but they can also be extremely problematic. Particularly when you're having to navigate, if we understand the power of storytelling, right? That even the Black press is picking and choosing what they want to say about Emmett, how they want to present Mamie, that they're crafting a narrative, right? So for me as a historian, it's not just that I'm going to the newspaper for the facts, right? I'm going there to see what was at stake for the NAACP, or what was at stake when, you have the Black woman. I'm trying to think of her name. I can't remember. She writes a piece in the Chicago Defender that's called "The Untold Story of Mamie," of Mamie Bradley, because that's what she was still called then, right? And she writes it over 6 different issues of the paper. And initially I could be like, oh, I'm getting all this information in fact, but I realized that, oh, she is trying to save Mamie Bradley, because there's politics at play between her and the NAACP, right? And so that the press becomes a place where history is being made, right? And the stakes are being defined. So in terms of thinking about the archives, everything is game, and everything has to be complicated and problematized, right? And that's what we're doing when we're training our students, or we're bringing people into the museums. We're getting them to think critically, right? To use their critical thinking skills to make sense of what was at stake when Mamie decided to let not just the press, but only the Black press into the funeral home to take those pictures. Um, and that there was a strategy at play, right? Because she understood, how the white press and the pornography of Black death, right, could be mobilized and used.
Ooh.
So she was extremely strategic.
Well, and that phrase, the pornography of Black death, is one I just want to kind of float over us when we think about what it is to have these images that tell such a necessary and powerful story, but understanding that many different people are looking at them, and that, there is an ease with which, the mainstream is used to seeing, Black people suffering, period. I just think about that a lot, in contemplating the importance of bearing witness. But that's just a very useful phrase, Crystal. Yeah. Also, I wanted to mention, when we talk about the poetry, that there's a wonderful, on, I think, the Poetry Society of America's website, Terrence Hayes put together a fantastic archive of Emmett Till poems. So if you Google Terrence Hayes and Emmett Till, you will probably find it. And it has that terrific Eve Ewing poem that you mentioned, Kevin. I would like Madam Historian to have a sweeping comment from you. You teach classes in the so-called long civil rights movement. We are in a very interesting moment. I think we would all agree in our history, and I don't know quite where to start it. I think we wouldn't only want to understand it presidentially, but certainly the move from the Obama years to the Trump years to where we are now is very dramatic as far as race in America. Crystal, where are we now, and how would you characterize it?
I think we're outside of what I would argue is a long civil rights movement, and we're in a new phase, right? But I think as a historian, we love to like have the sort of bookends in terms of dates. And if I had to bookend, I would say, the Black Lives Matter moment and movement marked a kind of shift. Right. And I'm not saying that it's different in many ways from what has come before, that it's a different generation taking the lessons from the previous generation to define a new movement. Right. And so it's not hard for me to imagine, Ida B. Wells saying Black Lives Matter. Like, yeah, she would have said that.
Yes.
And she did say that in so
Yes,
many
yes.
words. But that there was something different in terms of this generation and how they mobilize, and what it meant for the generation now that's out front to have come of age with the Black president. Like, I don't care. Obama could have just stood up there for 8 years and looked pretty. He did look pretty, but he did a lot of stuff. But nonetheless, but he, for that generation, for my kids, Charlie was 3. When can y'all hear me? My little earphone fell out, but I'm gonna assume y'all can still hear me. He was 3, and I remember saying to him by the time he was 5, I was like, Obama's the first Black president, and he was like, And I was like, what's wrong? He said, well, I would like to be the first Black president, right? And I was like, okay. And what it meant for this generation to come of age, right? And to have a Black person in the highest office in the land actually meant something. And I think it marked a shift. And I do think that we're in a moment where, in this pandemic and with this, with the George Floyd moment, it's a racial reckoning, right? People couldn't look away, right? In that way that Mamie Bradley said, you can't look away. The George Floyd death made it really difficult for people to look away. And I think we're experiencing what was part of a backlash that started to happen under Obama's presidency really pick up speed. in the post-Trump moment, right? Because white people, they looked, right? Because black people, we've been looking, but white people looked
Yeah.
and they saw and they said something, right? And so I think this is a moment where either we harness that, or because I think the Republican Party is really mobilizing to get people to look away. And that's what the sort of disinformation that's happening with critical race theory is really about, getting people to look away from the brutal reality of what it means to be Black, what it means to be poor, what it means to be Black, poor, and female in this country. And that if we are going to have a reckoning, something has to change fundamentally. And they don't want that to happen, right? Stacey Abrams means something, right? That they flipped Georgia, that means something, and that has come out of a racial education, right? That comes out of Black folks and white people going to that museum in D.C., right? It comes from us writing the poetry that you write, from us teaching the classes that we teach, that these young people are able to go into the street literate, right? Understanding that the law, how the law is supposed to work, right? And that's what critical race theory has done. If we really want to talk about, if we're going to end up going down that path. But I can rant. But I think we're at a moment, we're at a crossroads, and we have to decide. We're gonna keep pushing, as you used to say, we're gonna keep pushing that boulder up the hill.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of work to be done. We just have to keep doing
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you about critical race theory in a second, but Kevin, I'd love to hear you take a stab at that question of, how do you think about this period?
Yeah. I mean, I very much have been for a while now calling this a precedented time. I think there was at the beginning of the pandemic, especially, people were saying it was unprecedented, and I really think, if we look 100 years ago, a little bit longer, there was a pandemic. There was racial unrest and uprisings and race massacres in the Chicago riots of 1919 and Tulsa. Of course, we just commemorated 100 years 2 months ago. And so I think one of the things the museum's able to do is connect that past to our present. And I think it means a lot of things, which is thinking about the present too as something that we need to collect. And we've been very active in collecting Black Lives Matter material. We have material from the square here in DC that I think is really powerful and testifies to that. But how do we talk about those twin pandemics of racism and COVID-19, which is still with us? They're both still with us. How do we wrestle with those questions? And that's something we think about every day. Partially, we're going to talk about it in this exhibition, A Reckoning, that's about centered around the Brianna Taylor portrait, but really thinks about how Black folks have been painting and photographing and making art about protest and resistance and resilience for generations. And then at the same time, we're having an exhibition on Reconstruction called Make Good the Promises. And that show, I think, is going to really think about not just Reconstruction, but the legacy of Reconstruction and the ways that, right after the Civil War, there were these advances, and then they were rolled back, and voting rights were attacked, and Black representation was undermined, and racial violence was on the uptick. So all of that is a way of understanding now. And, because we're a museum, I think we're able to show firsthand how you get to experience that. You experience that in the slavery and freedom portions of our museum, but you're also going to be able to see what happened last summer, what feels like last week. And so understanding that, I think, is really important. And I imagine our visitors, which are both in person now, but also are digital, we have to remember, are going to be able to see the ways that the past is still very much present. And is a way of understanding it. And I think you put it so well. The very recent past, too, is something we have to contend with and understand. And it's changed very rapidly. We have a Black vice president, which we didn't have 6 months ago. Well, maybe a year ago, let's say, just to be safe. And so how do we represent now and the people who are experiencing that? And I think it's by doing both, by collecting what's happening now, helping interpret it, curate it, but also to talk about the past as we have. And we've planned this reconstruction show years ago, and now here it's coming out in the fall. It's opening on our 5th anniversary, and it's talking very much about now. And the legacy portion of that show is going to be really powerful, and we have some other things around our 5th anniversary that are going to tell that story of where we are now.
Crystal, I would love to hear, and then we're going to go to the many wonderful questions that are coming in. You teach, among other things at Yale, a course on critical race theory, what I like to call like the actual critical race theory. I would love if you could talk a little bit about, you alluded to the smokescreen, the diversion of the critical race theory brouhaha right now. But if you could also focus us on what it actually is.
Right. So, I mean, for me, as someone who teaches in Black Studies and as a historian, I think about the course as a way to introduce not just our majors, but any student who's interested in the history of race and the what I think of sort of Black critical studies, right? And looking at how Black people have theorized about their past and how they imagine their future. In critical race theory, the sort of thinking about it in traditional terms, if we want to start with Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, comes out of a legal term. Right. And so we start there. I give them a sense of what it is in the 1980s that provoked, and the 70s, that provoked critical race theory, which was this idea that, America is supposed to be a democratic, just place, equal protection under the law. But for some reason, Black people aren't benefiting from a so-called just system. So trying to understand the systemic problems within the legal justice system that continue to keep Black people not getting justice or service, or equal protection under the law. So that's a kind of starting point just to give them a sense. But then I make a broader argument that critical race theory is, we have it in literature, right? You can't read Toni Morrison and not understand her work as a kind of critical race theory, getting us to think and reimagine how race can be and how we can live in a more humane and just society and what that entails, right? And for my students, I always say it requires imagination, creativity, and the ability to tell a story with power. Right. And so that oftentimes, like after critical race theory, it's the power of storytelling is the subtitle of my course. And so then it means that they can actually understand why Emmett Till, in a world where there was so-called a trial, why nobody was ever punished for Emmett Till, right? That they have to understand how the jury system worked, right? And critical race theory would force our hand and say, well, why was there an all-white jury, all-white male jury, right? How can you have that in a society that claims, that someone should be judged by their peers? Right. So that's the work of critical race theory, to get the students to ask the question, right? So that then you can see how the injustice comes to play. And one of the exciting things about teaching critical race theory, wherever I teach it, is that it brings students of diverse backgrounds and different racial and ethnic backgrounds together to have these difficult conversations, because it is hard for students to think and talk about race, and also to get them to understand that what we do in Black studies is about the production of knowledge. It's not just about my opinions about race or how I experience race, even though that is a part of it, but getting them to understand that this is an intellectual project that has political implications, and not to be afraid of that. That the political implication is that we're moving towards racial justice, right? Or sexual justice, if we want to take Kimberly Crenshaw at that intersection, right? And not to lean back from that and say it's hard work. It is political work. And at some level, it is unbiased. If you're Black in this country, you cannot be biased about racism. You're going to be biased about racism, and getting them to understand that it's not that anti-racist work is not anti-white work, right? It's not anti-white people. So I think that's the work that I'm doing in critical race theory, and I'm doing it as a historian that is trying to give them a set of tools that they can take back into the archives, and ask the hard questions.
Thank you, Professor Feimster. That was beautiful. Thank you. We've got all these terrific questions. Here is one. To the point about the ease of accessibility to images of Black death, what are your thoughts about the ethics and responsibility for caretakers of history, curators, poets, artists, etc., in representing these traumas? I'd love to hear from both of you. Kevin, could you start?
Sure. I mean, I think we have very much a responsibility. I think when you write about your grandmother, you have to have an ethical conversation with yourself about that. But as the museum, as stewards of this history, we, for instance, had and still have a display about Tulsa and the Tulsa Massacre. I would say we were pretty early in talking about it in a museum setting like that. And it was really important to include it in the context of everything. And I think context is everything. I think it's really important and really different than if you walked in the museum and the first thing you saw was such horror. Instead, we try to tell the story that this is part of. And within that space, there's testimony by survivors, there's postcards. We sometimes have a sign and sometimes have other visual reminders that this might be upsetting to you. But I think it's important to show it, of course, because, there were postcards made of the destruction and sent as if it were a souvenir. And I think that's important to remember. We're not inventing that fact. And I think it's important to remember how we remember. And that's something that I think Juneteenth reminds us of. I mean, it's hard to believe, even 3 months ago that Juneteenth wasn't a national holiday and now it is. And so there is this kind of interesting moment we're in. I meant to say that earlier. But what Juneteenth caused for me to think about is the way that not only, can we reflect on freedom, but we can reflect on its delay and the fact that Juneteenth is because we weren't told right away in Texas, and so folks there turned that into a holiday. It always had a bit of irony in it. And I think there's a way in which you have to admit how the telling happened. How can we continue to talk about the telling of history? And I think the Tulsa Massacre, these race massacres present that in such a powerful way because the other side of the coin is very important too, to talk about Black achievement, Black pleasure, Black joy that often caused the destruction of Black Wall Street or the destruction of Black lives. It isn't simply someone stepping out of line. And that's the other thing I would say is we have such an important task before us to tell the whole story. And in the case of Emmett Till, always bothered me, and I talk about this in a poem, that we kind of assume that somehow the folks who said Emmett Till said something to the woman in the Bryant store, that somehow he caused his own death in some way by saying something. We know now, a lie, right? But why did we ever think that? And by we, I'm using the broadest sense of we. Why was that ever thought by well-meaning people that was the case? Why did we believe any part of that? And I think it's because we want a reason, even in the worst of moments, for some of this stuff to have happened. And the truth is that some of it was the presence of Black pleasure, Black joy, Black success in the case of Black Wall Street that caused and implied and drew out these kind of reprisals. And I think that's really, in the case of Wilmington, for instance, the Black press was very much targeted as part of that destruction. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind and tell that whole story. I'm going beyond your question, but only because I think
it's
that's
great.
part of telling that whole story is you have to sometimes look at it. But if you're asking me just personally, I couldn't watch the whole George Floyd video, for instance. I can't. It's just something I can't do personally. It doesn't mean, though, that sometimes we don't have to look at things that are tough in the right context and not just popping up on your screen in your bedroom while you're trying to go to sleep. I think that's the haunting part of our current moment is there aren't any limits on that. And one of the things I think the museum does is, we have a reflective space for people. We have context, we have places for people, and you're also doing it as a community. And I think that's another part of what sometimes we miss online, and part of the ethics we have to address as we're doing this together. I think it helps us think together and heal.
I would just pick up on two things that you said and just add, because I think what you said, Kevin, is really on point. And it's I think you used the word care and context, right? That as a historian, and who has written about rape and lynching, and who teaches that I have to take particular care with these images and with these stories. And I have to think about the context in which I'm telling those stories or I'm sharing those images, right? And so I can think about two on a personal level. When I went to publish Southern Horrors, and I had to think about the cover. And it was very clear to me right away that I was not going to put a lynching image on the cover of my book. And for a host of reasons. But mostly I felt like if I don't want people to have to live with that on their table, right? Or on their shelf. And what would it mean for my kids to have to see that every day in my house, right? And so context mattered, right? And that's not to say that there are images in the book that grapple and can really work through what's at stake in putting these images in the book, right? And then when I'm teaching, I really have to think about who my students are and where they're coming in, right? And how difficult it is for particularly my Black students, to bear witness to images in a classroom setting sometimes. And so I actually like to use Eyes on the Prize a lot. And because it has the kind of images and the visuals. And the one thing that it's hard. It's hard. There's a lot that's hard to watch, but there's a lot that I love about Eyes on the Prize. When you see the young people like marching down the street and singing, there's this kind of balance, right? So I think care and context, right? Again, thinking about who your audience is, what are they coming into the space for? Right. And that's something, for you, it's easy to think in terms of curatorial. You're curating the museum, right? And so that often to think about, how am I curating my lectures? What images am I putting up? What sounds, what music? Because it can be really painful and difficult for my Black students to have to grapple with that. And that's not to say that I'm trying to protect them from it, but I also know that at some level they have to bear witness to it. And I figured out that the Eyes on the Prize is the way to do that. So I think we all have to grapple with that, but I think it's an important question, and I think it's not one that we can take for granted. So I want to thank whoever asked that question. I don't think we have the answers, but I think we are all grappling with that, and we have to do. We have to. I think we can do better. That's all I'm gonna say. Because I think that in some arenas, that we can do better. Not at the museum. I think the museum's doing great, and I think I did
Thank
right
you.
with my comments. No shade here.
Here's another question, and I'm so where I don't have everyone's name and location. So if it's your question, then thank you. There was a powerful article that came out in the Atlantic a few days ago about elements of Till's story that we still don't have answers to. And what I would add to that also, that I see in the chat, is there's conversation about Carolyn Bryant, the woman who accused Emmett Till, who made a deathbed confession that she made it all up. So I'll kind of throw that in there too. There was a line in the piece about how white Mississippians, by not being taught Till's story, had an innocence that their parents and grandparents had wanted for them. Can you comment on why this idea of innocence is so damaging for us?
The thing I would say is, and I don't have the quote to hand, but I use it in Bunk, which was my book about fakery in American life, that James Baldwin said that innocence is the crime. Like this pretending innocence
Mm.
is the actual crime. And I can grab it in a second if, I should have it stacked here. It's back there somewhere. The upshot is that I think he's really right about the ways that innocence kind of can get almost weaponized or amnesia. There's aspects of our forgetting that aren't simply innocent, and that innocence actually hides some willful disregard. And I think one of our jobs as a museum is to represent the story, which is an American story. The African American story is at the center of the American experience. And so, how do we tell that story? And what's been really heartening to me are the ways that people want to know. They want to know more. They go online and try to experience it. They want to see. They return to our spaces. It's really powerful in the midst still of a pandemic. People come in the door because they want to know and see for themselves, and I think that's really the powerful
Mhm.
moment. So I haven't read that specific piece, but we're always learning, and history is evolving and learning new things. And one of our jobs, I think, is again to represent living history, and the way that we tell history is also changing, and new information comes. But like I said, I'm not surprised that that was made up. There's absolutely no
Mhm.
way that was true. And the fact that it was even kind of thought is part of what I think we need to think about collectively, why we needed that part of the story.
Mhm.
Yeah, and
Mhm.
again, it goes back to context, right? So, why in 1954 did the Bryants need to make up that story? Why did they feel that they had to teach Emmett Till a lesson, right? That we know it comes
Mhm.
on the heels of Brown v. Board of Education, right? That there is a real context in which white fears and anxieties, right, about whether it's interracial sex or what have you, which I make an argument that it's about, I follow in Ida B. Wells' footsteps. This is about political, social, and economic power, right? And what that and how that gets mapped onto a sexualized narrative of hyper black masculinity, that then basically positions black people outside the sort of category of human rights, and thus for they can be mobbed and lynched, right? Um, as far as thinking about this question of how we make sense of, in some ways, these untruths. It's hard, and how do we make sense of untruths in the face of people not wanting to remember, right? And that in some ways we all know the instinct to want to protect our children from difficult stories or painful stories. So in that sense, you can understand why people might not want their kids to know this stuff. But as historians and as Black people, we understand the stakes, that it comes at a real high cost for what we want in the present and what we imagine for the future. We just can't pretend that democracy and equity are a given. That for Black people, we can't. We have to constantly fight for it, and we have to constantly hold our nation's feet to the fire. And doing that requires remembering. It requires telling those stories, acknowledging where we didn't get it right, that the nation did not get it right. And, if you have to acknowledge that, and for white people, it means that you have to give up something in acknowledging that. And we all know that power does not give up power without a fight. And that's what it means. If you are to acknowledge African American history as a part of American history, then you have to bear witness to the lies, to the violence, and to the demonization of Black people, and what that has cost us. So I think, yeah, that white people don't want to remember. They don't.
Mm.
Um,
Mm. This has been such a rich and real and generous conversation. And to close us out, Kevin is going to share some poetry with us.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor to have been here, and it's an honor to read to and with you, Elizabeth, and thank you so much, Crystal. I thought I would end with part of a poem, just because it's a little on the long side. It's a poem called Money Road, uh, which is about Emmett Till and his death, but also about this particular pilgrimage I paid to Money, Mississippi, where he was visiting from. He was lynched somewhere else slightly. And in the poem, this is a true thing that when I was there, it began to snow, and it was Mississippi. Don't snow that much, so it was a strange, ghostly effect that you'll hear referred to in the poem. I don't know if there's anything else you need to know. Um, yeah, it's near a place called Greenwood, and we're driving from Greenwood. When I pick up the poem, we're driving from Greenwood to Money. We're on our way again, along the Money Road, past grand houses and porte cocheres set back from the lane, crossing the bridge to find markers of what's no more there. Even the underpass bears a name. It's all too grave, the fake sharecropper homes of Tallahatchie Flats rented out along the road, staged bottle trees chasing away nothing. The new outhouse whose crescent door foreign tourists pay extra for. Cotton planted in strict rows for show. A quiet snow globe of pain I want to shake. While the flakes fall like ash, we race the train to reach the place Emmett Till last whistled or smiled or did nothing. Money more a crossroads than the crossroads be. Its gnarled tree, the Bryant store facing the tracks, now turned the color of earth, tumbling down slow as the snow, white and insistent as the woman who sent word of that uppity boy, her men who yanked you out your uncle's home into the yard, into oblivion, into the store abutting the Money Gin Co., whose sign, worn away, now reads un or sin, I swear, whose giant gin fans, like those lashed and anchored to your beaten body, still turn. Shot, dumped, dredged, your face not even a mask, a marred, unspared, sightless stump. All your mother insists we must see to know what they did to my baby. The true Tallahatchie twisting south. The Delta death's second cousin, once removed. You down for only the summer to leave the stifling city where later you will be waked, displayed, defiant, a dark glass. There are things that cannot be seen but must be. Buried barely this place no one can keep. Yet how to kill a ghost? The fog of our outdoor talk, we breathe, we grieve, we drink our tidy drinks. I think now winter will out, the snow bless and kiss this cursed earth. Or is it cussed? I don't yet know. Let the cold keep still your bones.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you so much. Things that cannot be seen but must be, I think, is the place that we should pause, not close, with tremendous gratitude to both of you and to all of our people's history and resilience that is running through you in your work. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
for the conversation. This was
Okay.
great, Kevin. Thank you.
Yes.
Good night, everybody. Good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.